It's time now for the disruptors. George Tsilis, senior markets correspondent, is here with today's company, and that's AMD. The stock is surging higher after earnings today. George, AMD is up 5%, bringing a bunch of other chip stocks with it. Nvidia up 12%, Broadcom up 10%, Qualcomm up 5%. Take us through the numbers for AMD. What has investors so upbeat?
Well, I think obviously, the stocks that you mentioned are moving higher. We're essentially in a counter-trend rally right now. So that corresponds to some of the earnings announcements yesterday, which are big. Microsoft, AMD is another in the AI chipset space. But if you look at AMD overall, its earnings were actually really good. And so if you look at the EPS numbers they printed, it was 67 cents. It was 69 cents, forgive me, versus the 68-cent estimate. So they beat by a penny. That was higher by about 17% year over year. And then if you look at their sales numbers at $5.83 billion, they did beat the estimates as well, higher by 9%. And they did guide slightly higher for their AI revenues, which were expected previous to be $4 billion per annum going forward, at least for this year. And they increased that to about $4.3 billion. And their data center revenue actually increased 115% year over year, as well as gross margin expansion. So they actually are showing some promising signs, both on an operational metric standpoint, revenue metrics. But if you look at the stock overall in the last few months, it's been down considerably. And I think it has to do with the fact that valuations might be still quite rich for this particular name, considering some of the cheaper valuations in Nvidia. And I think that speaks to why we're seeing a little bit of a disparity in the price action today, with Nvidia higher over 10% versus AMD. But then nonetheless, I think that AMD is moving in the right direction when it comes down to their data processing units, or DPUs, which are essentially inference chips that compete with NVIDIA's Blackwell technology. So they're behind the curve, AMD is, when it comes to GPUs, but they are making a lot of inroads when it comes down to general purpose inference chips, or data crunching, GPUs, if you will. But at the same time, they still have a lot of exposure in the CPU market, with about 30% global market share, and about 15% of that is China. So there are some concerns with AMD: valuation, growth, CPU exposure. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of the analysts, if you look at them, are adjusting their price targets, but many of them are actually moving them lower and maintain neutral ratings. If you look at Truist, they actually brought their target down to 156 from 162. Bernstein actually increased their target slightly to 150 from 140, but both of these firms basically maintain neutral or market perform ratings.
So despite the fact that AMD topped expectations and guided higher, it seems like analysts are, not as upbeat about how far shares can run. Given that, what would be your example trade for AMD?
Yeah, so just in principle, I mean, if you look at, valuation just quickly here, yesterday AMD was trading at the same multiple, around 40 times forward earnings than Nvidia, but Nvidia is growing 6 to 8 times faster. So I think that helps bring some context into why we're seeing some performance struggles in AMD versus Nvidia, but both the stocks have been down in the last 2 weeks because of essentially a sell-off and a liquidity grab. Now, with that said, I think AMD looks like it may hold some technical levels. Earlier today, it hit around 154, which is right around its 200-day moving average. So I think that's going to be an area of technical resistance. So with that said, I think that it'll hold, the 136-ish area, which was basically the previous day's low. So I'm going to sell a cash secured put in August monthly, essentially the 139 put, and I could earn about $3 of credit per share, or $300 a contract. So effectively, all the stock has to do is hold 139 or higher between now and expiration in a couple of weeks for August, and you get to keep that premium. Now, if you do put on this trade, you have to be willing and able to take ownership of the stock at 139 with a $136 cost basis. So the whole premise on this trade is I'm selling a low delta, about 30 delta, which implies a 70% probability that the stock will expire above 139. But at the same time, I'm also selling high implied volatility premium with the volatility index VIX above 15. So I typically do that. As long as the VIX is above 15, we'll sell premium.
So, George, when it comes to AMD, it's obviously been living in NVIDIA's shadows for this whole AI race, really. Is there anything that you saw in the earnings report that makes you think it could break out of those shadows a bit?
Well, I think what's happening, there's two things happening. I think a problem for Intel and AMD is the CPU markets because China is making a lot of investment in CPUs. If you look going back news-wise, China is actually looking to restrict using Intel or AMD CPUs in government computers. Therefore, they're going to be building out their own CPU technology. So I think that's a problem from that revenue stream. I think if you look at the client and data center and server markets, those are growing for AMD. And I think they're parallel computing when it comes to looking at competing with Nvidia's Blackwell chips, which are their inference chips. I think AMD is making a compelling case to start encroaching on that market share over time. So they're general purpose technologies. They're not the advanced technologies that Nvidia has, but I think there's room for them to grow. It just comes down to growth relative to value. And I think that's one of the reasons why AMD has been a significant underperformer in the past 3 to 6 months relative to Nvidia, which again, like I said, has pulled back. But if you even look at the charts comparing the two companies, you'll see a lot more symmetry in Nvidia versus AMD because it's easier value because their growth trajectory is more in line versus AMD's, which is a little bit more choppy.
All right, and AMD up about 5% today, still down 1% year to date. George Tsilis, thanks so much.